Here we go. We have completed the introductory of Progress and Poverty, published in 1879. Uh, we will now start with Book 1. It is in, looks like 5 chapters. Wages and Capital. Chapter 1, The Current Doctrine of Wages, Its Insufficiency. We have a nice quote here. He that is to follow philosophy must be a free man in mind. From Ptolemy. Good old Ptolemy. All right, we begin. Reducing to its most compact form the problem we have set out to investigate, let us examine step by step the explanation which political economy, as now accepted by the best authority, gives of it. The cause which produces poverty in the midst of advancing wealth is evidently the cause which exhibits itself in the tendency everywhere recognized of wages to a minimum. Some might say to uh, a beneath, what's the popular term? A livable wage, I guess. Let us therefore put our inquiry into this compact form. Why, in spite of increase in productive power, do wages tend to a minimum which will give but a bare living? Yes, the same argument we have now, they had then. The answer of the current political economy is that wages are fixed by the ratio between the number of laborers and the amount of capital devoted to the employment of labor, and constantly tend to the lowest amount on which laborers will consent to live and reproduce, because the increase in the number of laborers tends naturally to follow and overtake any increase in capital, the increase of the divisor being thus held in check only by the possibilities of the quotient. The dividend may be increased to infinity without greater result. Quotient is the result of doing a division problem. In current thought, this doctrine holds all but undisputed sway. It bears the endorsement of the very highest names among the cultivators of political economy, and though there have been attacks upon it, they are generally more formal than real. We have a footnote. It reads, "This seems to me true of Mr. Thornton's objections, for while he denies the existence of a predetermined wage fund, consisting of a portion of capital set apart for the purchase of labor, yet he yet holds, which is the essential thing, that wages are drawn from capital, and that increase or decrease of capital is increase or decrease of the fund available for the payment of wages. The most vital attack upon the wage fund doctrine of which I know is that of Professor Francis A. Walker, The Wages Question, published in New York in 1876. Yet he admits that wages are in large part advanced from capital, which, so far as it goes, is all that the staunchest supporter of the wage fund theory could claim, while he fully accepts the Malthusian theory. Thus his practical conclusions in no wise differ from those reached by expounders of the current theory." We're going to hear a lot about Malthusian theory as we go through this book, from what I remember when I read it, and it will be thoroughly displaced. The Malthusian theory is basically we're overpopulating. You can just replace that by the overpopulation theory. We continue. It is assumed by Buckle as the basis of his generalizations of universal history. It is taught in all or nearly all the great English and American universities, and is laid down in textbooks which aim at leading the masses to reason correctly upon practical affairs, while it seems to harmonize with the new philosophy which, having in a few years all but conquered the scientific world, is now rapidly permeating the general mind. Yes, all that to say that it is popular, that wages are paid by the amount of capital. And yes, we have a comment from Jotson in the chat describing Malthusian theory as Scrooge theory, referencing Ebenezer Scrooge from The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, published in, I don't know, Did Dickens have any quotes about Georges? He was pre-Georgists, probably. I don't know. It's a hobby of mine now to collect authors I like when they say things about Georgism, but I don't remember one from Dickens. We continue. Thus entrenched in the upper regions of thought, it is in cruder form even more firmly rooted in what may be styled the lower. What gives to the fallacies of protection such a tenacious hold, in spite of their evident inconsistencies and absurdities, is the idea that the sum to be distributed in wages is in each community a fixed one, which the competition of "foreign labor" must still further subdivide. The same idea underlies most of the theories which aim at the abolition of interest and the restriction of competition, as the means whereby the share of the laborer in the general wealth can be increased, and it crops out in every direction among those who are not thoughtful enough to have any theories, as may be seen in the columns of newspapers and the debates of legislative bodies. And yet, widely accepted and deeply rooted as it is, it seems to me that this theory does not tally with obvious facts. For, if wages depend upon the ratio between the amount of labor seeking employment and the amount of capital devoted to its employment, the relative scarcity or abundance of one factor must mean the relative abundance or scarcity of the other. Thus, capital must be relatively abundant where wages are high, and relatively scarce where wages are low. Now, as the capital used in paying wages must largely consist of the capital constantly seeking investment, the current rate of interest must be the measure of its relative abundance or scarcity. So if it be true that wages depend upon the ratio between the amount of labor seeking employment and the capital devoted to its employment, then high marks the mark of the relative scarcity of then high wages then high wages, the mark of the relative scarcity of labor, must be accompanied by low interest, and the mark of the relative abundance of capital, and reversely low wages, must be accompanied by high interest. Yeah. When there's not a lot of labor, wages would be high. When there's a lot of capital, uh, the implication is low wages with high interest. We are in a high interest rate economy today. That is true. So this is what we'd assume to be true if wages depend upon the ratio between the amount of labor seeking employment and the capital devoted to its employment. But this is not the fact, but the contrary. Eliminating from interest the element of insurance and regarding only interest proper, or the return for the use of capital, is it not a general truth that interest is high where and when wages are high, and low where and when wages are low? Both wages and interest have been higher in the United States than in England, in the Pacific than in the Atlantic states. Is it not a notorious fact that where labor flows for higher wages, capital also flows for higher interest? Is it not true that wherever there has been a general rise or fall in wages, there has been at the same time a similar rise or fall in interest? In California, for instance, when wages were higher than anywhere else in the world, so also was interest higher. Wages and interest have in California gone down together. When common wages were 65 a day, the ordinary bank rate of interest was 24% per annum. Now that common wages are 62 or 62.50 a day, the ordinary bank rate is from 10 to 12%. This whole bit is a little bit outside of my experience, I suppose. I don't often think about the going interest rates. I'll continue. Now, this broad general fact that wages are higher in new countries where capital is relatively scarce than in old countries where capital is relatively abundant is too glaring to be ignored. Jotson says it was a different time. 20% interest in wild and monetary theory is different today. It is, and there is Georgist theory and people who discuss monetary theory through a Georgist lens, and I am not super familiar with that. I've always assumed that a lot of the banking and monetary policy is just sort of downstream of the principles of Georgism. Like our banking industry is super leveraged on land speculation. Like that's what most bank loans are for, is funding the purchasing of land and skimming off the top. But I can't really back that up too much, and it definitely seems like the Federal Reserve is some weird manipulation nominally to aid in I don't know, ameliorating the boom and bust cycle. But yeah, the power. I don't even know exactly who has the power to print money, but that's it's like crazy to me that the common political discourse doesn't call out that as like a primary role of government, and the fact that the Fed is this sort of other entity. I don't know. I don't know. It seems very much like clever people fiddling around as a way of distracting us from the exploitation of land. But I don't know. Here we go. Where was I? 12. Now this. Okay. Now this broad general fact that wages are higher in new countries than in old countries. And although very lightly touched upon, it is noticed by the expounders of the current political economy. The manner in which it is noticed proves what I say, that it is utterly inconsistent with the accepted theory of wages. For in explaining it, such writers as Mill, Fawcett, and Price virtually give up the theory of wages upon which, in the same treatises, they formally insist. Though they declare that wages are fixed by the ratio between capital and laborers, they explain the higher wages and interest of new countries by the general relative production of wealth. I shall hereafter show that this is not the fact, but that on the contrary, the production of wealth is relatively larger in old and densely populated countries than in new and sparsely populated countries. But at present I merely wish to point out the inconsistency. For to say that the higher wages of new countries are due to greater proportionate production is clearly to make the ratio with production, and not the ratio with capital, the determinator of wages. Though this inconsistency does not seem to have been perceived by the class of writers to whom I refer, it has been noticed by one of the most logical of the expounders of the current political economy, Professor Cairns. We have a footnote that just references Cairns' book, Some Leading Principles of Political Economy Newly Expounded, Chapter 1, Part 2. Professor Cairns endeavors in a very ingenious way to reconcile the fact with the theory by assuming that in new countries where industry is generally directed to the production of food, and what in manufactures is called raw material, a large proportion of the capital used in production is devoted to the payment of wages than in older countries where a greater part must be expended in machinery and material, and thus in the new country, though capital is scarcer and interest is higher, the amount determined to the payment of wages is really larger, and wages are also higher. For instance, this looks like a bit of a typo. For instance, of probably 610,000 devoted in an old country to manufacture. No, maybe it is 6,100,000. For instance, devoted in an old country to manufactures, 680,000 would probably be expended for buildings, machinery, and the purchase of materials, leaving but 620,000 to be paid out in wages. Those don't, so 620,000 plus 680,000, that would be 1,300,000. That would be our budget. I don't recall seeing such typos when I read my hard copy book. I only suspect this might be a digital issue. I don't know. Let's just keep going and see if we can make sense of it. Uh, although, well, I guess my recording has been going for a while. We will end today's uh, devotional in an awkward spot, confused about mathematics. You'll have to come back for that satisfying resolution. I will see you guys next time.